Hi there and welcome. This is Smart Prosperity, the podcast, a bi-weekly show about the green economy in Canada, the current affairs, the politics, the business, the technology, and the ideas at the intersection of the environment and the economy. I'm your host, Eric Campbell. On today's show, we've got something out of this world, the environmental impacts of space tourism. With not one, but two commercial space flights having taken off last month, we ask an astrophysicist and an atmospheric scientist, what does a new space age mean for climate change and for the environment here on planet Earth? After that, Mike Moffat shares his regular list of 5 other things happening in the green economy this week. And of course, the entire program will be infused with an excess of space puns. Buckle your seatbelts. This episode of Smart Prosperity, the podcast, is ready for launch.
7, 6, 5, 4. Command engine start. 2, 1.
And New Shepard has cleared the tower on our way to space with our first human crew. Go, Jeff. Go, Mark. Go, Wally. Go, Oliver.
That, of course, is the sound of Jeff Bezos, the founder of Amazon, and his crew taking off for a commercial spaceflight on July 20th. The rocket carried 4 private citizens 120 kilometers above the Earth, just beyond where the planet's atmosphere ends, for 10 minutes of extremely expensive space tourism. Just a few days earlier, Sir Richard Branson did the same, also shot up to the edge of space in his company's spaceplane, which will also soon be available for paying passengers. And meanwhile, Elon Musk's SpaceX is preparing for multi-day commercial space trips in orbit, as much as 4 times farther into space than its competitors. Sir Richard Branson had a point when he said we're on the brink of a new space age. Whereas the international community has been averaging about 150 orbital and suborbital space launches per year over the past few years, Virgin Galactic now plans on reaching 400 launches per year all on its own. Some experts project we could reach 1,000 space launches per year in the not-too-distant future, a 10-fold increase from today. All of this put together, says Swiss investment bank UBS, means that space tourism and commercial space travel could grow into a $20 billion industry by 2030. The question for my next 2 guests is, what are the environmental impacts of space travel, and can we mitigate them as the space tourism industry grows? First, I'm speaking with Dr. Parshati Patel. Dr. Patel is an astrophysicist and science communicator based at the University of Western in London, Ontario. Dr. Patel, thanks for joining the show.
Thanks for having me.
Dr. Patel, first, how excited are you about the dawn of space tourism?
First of all, feel free to call me Parshati. And this is definitely one of those times I'm so grateful that I'm alive in this era, because what we are seeing now is, I think, what would have people experience the same kind of feeling when, the first airplanes the airplane industry launched. Now, a similar trend is going to be there for space as well. It definitely isn't going to happen overnight. It still is going to be a long time before, you and I can pay for it and just, go to the moon and take our vacation there. But it is definitely going in a direction which is pushing everyone, scientists, engineers, and people who are, visionaries to think of things in a more accessible and environmentally friendly way.
Right, and that's exactly what we're trying to assess today, are the environmental impacts of this growing industry. Now, space tourism, of course, is a new phenomenon, but we have decades of experience sending astronauts and satellites into space. What do we know then about the environmental impacts of space travel?
So if you just look at a rocket launch, just by looking at it, you can guess a lot of the things that are happening at that time. You see that burst of the sound that you hear if you're near, or you can see those, clouds of material coming out of the rockets. That short amount of time of getting to space, you're emitting a lot of things that are then sitting in the atmosphere. So there is a lot of environmental effects
So you mentioned kind of the emissions from the rocket launch. We'll circle back on that one. I'm also interested about waste. Is waste a problem with space travel? We hear sometimes about space junk. I don't know how big an issue that actually is.
Yeah, so space debris, space junk, orbital debris, those are definitely something that we actively think about when we put things in space. How is it going to react, let's say in 10 years when it's not going to be active, right? We currently have around 3,400 active satellites in space, but at the same time, we have around a little bit over 3,100 inactive satellites in space.
And typically, a lot of this waste stays up in space, and our primary concern is, of course, kind of the environment down here on planet Earth. Is there waste that does come back down to Earth? In terms of kind of the rockets propelling satellites and astronauts into space, often I think those things get discarded. What happens to that waste?
Yeah, so I know like the current new industry, what they're really trying to do is trying to make things that are as much reusable as possible. But that has not been the case for a very long time. And so a lot of the material either just sits, at the bottom of the ocean, if that's where it falls, or sometimes, it's been retrieved. Really, most of the time we're like rebuilding and trying to put them back into space. So we're basically using very much still the same technology that we had for a very, very long time. But the fact that, with the newer technology, what we are really trying to do is bring that idea back that we don't want to do what we have been doing is wasting a lot of our resources, and trying to make sure that whatever we are, using, we can try and see if we can make use of that again.
Yes, and I note that that of the three commercial space tourism companies that are emerging right now, Virgin Galactic has kind of a disposable part of their rocket, but both Blue Origin and SpaceX, as far as I understand, are using reusable rockets.
That's true. However, both, like all of them, aren't 100% reusable yet. There are still parts of things that we aren't using, which, I think we are trying to make use of things as much as possible, which I think, given the trajectory, it is how it's supposed to go. You cannot just come up with a new rocket that's going to be like 100% reusable, or that the rocket fuel you're going to be using are like 0% emissions or anything like that. It does take a while to get to that place, and we are actually going to that place, which is I think something that's remarkable, and something that's achieved, I think, relatively in a short amount of time.
And you mentioned rocket fuel. What kind of environmental impact does that potentially have?
Yeah, so rocket fuel, it's very interesting. There are a lot of things depending on the kind of fuel you use. What kinds of leftovers could have carbon dioxide that is left over, or you could have, like water vapor, which we know are like big additions to the whole climate change aspect that we're thinking of. These two seem to be of the most concern, and that is something that I know a lot of people are researching on, is trying to figure out the impact of that on our climate.
And we're going to speak to one of those researchers next, so thanks for setting that up. I want to ask you one last question, Parshati. Upon return, and this has nothing to do with space tourism, but thinking about what the potential is, what the opportunities are, upon returning to Earth after his suborbital space flight last month, Jeff Bezos quipped that there could be a future where the world sends all its polluting industries into outer space, things like cement production and steel production, the things that release tons of emissions that we have a hard time controlling here on Earth, send them all to space. Is that as crazy as it sounds?
I don't know. I mean, if we could help, the environment by doing things up in space, it's a good way to start thinking. However, we don't know how plausible that is given the current situation and scenario we have.
Right. A fair answer. It sounds to me like it would be just extraordinarily expensive, but maybe there's a day when we get there.
Yeah.
Dr. Patel, thank you for sharing your enthusiasm with us and walking us through some of the environmental considerations associated with space tourism.
Thank you for having me.
That was Dr. Parshati Patel from the University of Western. Now, you heard Dr. Patel refer to the fuel used to propel rockets into space. My next guest has done extensive research in this space. If you've read anything about the environmental implications of space tourism recently, chances are it cited her research. Dr. Eloise Marais is an associate professor at University College London. I'm reaching her at her home office in Leicester, England. Dr. Marais, thanks for being on the show.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me on.
Now, Dr. Marais, you say that the biggest environmental impact from space tourism is the rocket fuel. What should we know about the rocket fuels being used right now?
Yeah, so the major players in the space tourism industry all use different types of fuel. And so the composition of the fuel really determines what kinds of chemicals are produced when these combust. And so the fuel that's used by Jeff Bezos' company is hydrogen and oxygen, whereas the fuel type that's used by Virgin Galactic and by SpaceX is carbon-based. And so carbon-based fuel will produce byproducts like carbon dioxide and black carbon or soot, whereas the hydrogen-based fuel from Blue Origin will produce water vapor.
So three different kinds of rockets, three different technologies using three different kinds of fuels. From a climate change perspective, which of these fuels is most problematic, do you believe?
Yeah, so the carbon-based fuels that Virgin Galactic and SpaceX use will produce carbon dioxide as a byproduct when they combust. And so, of course, carbon dioxide, we know, is a greenhouse gas, and so it contributes to warming. And so that is of particular concern to us. But also these carbon-based fuels can produce black carbon or soot, and that can have a warming effect on the atmosphere. It's not classified as a greenhouse gas. These are dark particles that are suspended in the atmosphere. Because they're dark, they're very efficient at absorbing incoming sunlight and can, as a result, warm the local atmosphere.
Soot, that's something that I'm more accustomed to hearing about in the context of kind of the Industrial Revolution, in the 19th century, not futuristic space age. How worried do we need to be about soot as a pollutant?
Yeah, so soot has definitely had a lot of attention as being very, very efficient at warming the atmosphere. So its warming effect is very large. It's something that's produced in quite large quantities from, for example, combusting coal. But coal-fired power plants are regulated in most parts of the world, and so there are ways to prevent that soot from being released into the atmosphere. So for rockets, the main concern is that when the soot is released, it's released into multiple layers in the atmosphere. And so we really need to understand what quantities it's released into these layers in the atmosphere and what can be its effect on the local atmosphere.
Right. And so that brings me to another point, which is, typically we release pollutants on this planet quite close to the planet. Even aviation is releasing pollutants not far off of the surface of the planet. When we're talking about space tourism, of course, these vessels, these rockets are launching into the highest levels and through the top of our atmosphere. How much or how little do we know about the impacts of air pollutants at those high levels in our atmosphere?
Yeah, so we certainly know that there are many chemicals that are produced from these rockets that can deplete ozone in the layer in the atmosphere where it protects us from harmful UV radiation. So this is the stratospheric ozone layer that is about 10 or so kilometers above us. When these pollutants are released into the upper atmosphere, they tend to persist for 2-3 years, if not longer, which means that a space tourism industry that is sustained for multiple years would lead to the accumulation of these pollutants.
And these pollutants linger for 2 to 3 years. How does that compare to how long they would last at lower levels of altitude?
It varies from one pollutant to the next, but in a relative sense, they would last lower in the atmosphere for minutes to hours to days to months. So it's substantially longer when they're released higher up into the atmosphere.
Okay, so the air pollutants at those high levels of the atmosphere aren't necessarily issues from a climate perspective, but from other potential adverse environmental impacts. I want to recognize that you identified both Virgin Galactic and SpaceX as having these problematic carbon-based fuels, at least problematic from a climate perspective. That leaves Jeff Bezos' Blue Origin company. What's different about the fuel being used by that rocket?
Yeah, so they're using hydrogen and oxygen to propel their rocket into space. And when hydrogen and oxygen, or when hydrogen combusts, it's going to produce water vapor as opposed to producing CO2, which the other two rockets produce. And so water vapor does sound innocuous, but unfortunately, when it is released into the stratospheric ozone layer, it can undergo further reactions that contribute to depletion of ozone. It is also a greenhouse gas. So close to the surface of the Earth, we have abundant water vapor that actually behaves as a greenhouse gas, but it's likely that the water vapor that's released closer to the surface of the Earth from these rockets won't make a very large contribution.
Yeah, and let's talk about the size of the contribution. Obviously, space tourism and space travel are quite infrequent activities. I mentioned off the top that there are, ranging from 100 to 150 rocket launches per year, compared to 100,000 flights launching every day on this planet. At what stage does space tourism and space travel and the pollution being caused by these activities start to register?
Yeah, I think that's going to depend on a lot of factors. I think it's going to depend on how large the space tourism industry will be at full capacity, and also the number of rocket launches each of these companies launch each year. Because their different rockets have different fuel types which produce different chemicals. And so what we really need to understand to be able to answer that question is what their offerings will be at full capacity. So far, we only know that Virgin Galactic plans to offer one flight per day. We don't know yet what Blue Origin's offerings will be. And so once we have that kind of information, we can run the speculative scenario through a model that can represent these complex processes to be able to assess at what point the space tourism industry could become competitive with something like the chemicals that are produced from the aircraft industry.
The space tourism industry is so nascent that maybe some of those regulations aren't there yet, similar to the aviation industry. What rules are there to monitor and contain the environmental impacts of space travel?
Currently, there are environmental impact assessments that have taken place at the launch site. So you could go online and search for the environmental impact assessment for the Blue Origin site, Van Horn in Texas. But beyond that, there isn't any regulation for the amount of chemicals that are released during the rocket launch. And so, of course, this is of particular concern because growth of an unregulated industry can have and has had in the past significant impacts on the environment.
So fuel is the fuel being used by these rockets is kind of a key source of concern, maybe when it comes to the pollution of the space tourism and space travel industry. You mentioned that these three rockets that we're seeing, these three commercial companies that we're seeing emerge in this space are using three different kinds of fuels. Are there other kind of rocket fuel options that are out there or that could be out there that are maybe greener or more environmentally benign?
I'm not a rocket scientist, but I know that there have been demonstrations of using biofuel as rocket fuel. And so the idea behind biofuel is that that's from plant material, and so the plants grow, they suck up CO2 while they're growing, and then you burn the fuel that's generated from these plants, and that releases CO2. And so it sounds like a closed loop in that there's net zero CO2 produced, but unfortunately biofuels are also not strictly renewable. There's land that's required to grow the plant material. There are synthetic fertilizers that are required to ensure that it's productive when it grows, and then insecticides and pesticides. So, I mean, even if you dig into the details of how these kinds of fuels are developed and produced, there aren't really any strictly renewable or clean types of fuel.
But maybe cleaner. So no silver bullet for eliminating pollution from the space tourism and space travel industry, but maybe some fuels that release fewer pollutants than others. Dr. Marais, thank you so much for being on the show today. This was a fascinating conversation. I appreciate the research that you're doing and sharing some of the highlights with us.
Sure, it was great chatting to you.
That was Dr. Héloïse Marais from University College London. For a link to some of her recent articles on the impacts of space tourism on air pollution, go to this episode's webpage at podcast.smartprosperity.ca. Now, those of you who have been listening this summer know about the Smart Prosperity Podcast Summertime Book Club. I've been asking each of our guests what they're reading this summer. Here is what Dr. Patel said.
The book is called Leadership Moments from NASA, Achieving the Impossible. And so this book is actually by Dr. Dave Williams. He is a retired Canadian astronaut, and also by Elizabeth Howell.
And here is what Dr. Héloïse Marais had to share.
Operation Paperclip, which is about the secret intelligence program that was established in the US after World War II.
Now, space tourism is a hot topic just now, but there's much more than that happening in the green economy over the past couple of weeks. To recap everything else, I turn to my colleague Mike Moffat. Mike is a senior director here at Smart Prosperity Institute, and here he is with 5 other things happening in the green economy this week.
Thanks, Eric. Here are the 5 things that I'm watching this week. Number 1, a crippling drought continues to hit the prairies and other parts of Canada, with Manitoba suffering its driest July on record. Crop yields are expected to be dramatically lower, and cattle farmers are struggling to find feed. The drought is also leading to water shortages across Western Canada. Number 2, the global economic recovery from COVID-19 will drive greenhouse gas emissions to record highs, according to a new report from the International Energy Agency. It finds that only 2% of government stimulus funding around the world has been targeted at clean energy, much lower than what is needed to move towards net zero by 2050. Number 3, the Quebec government has rejected a new liquefied natural gas facility that would carry natural gas from Western Canada for shipping to international markets. The decision cited the project's contribution to greenhouse gas emissions. The International Energy Agency has warned that there can be no new investment in fossil fuel projects if the world is to hit its climate goals. Number 4, major pension plans and institutional investors, including the Ontario Teachers' Pension Plan, have committed $7 billion to Brookfield Asset Management's new Global Transition Fund, making it the largest pool of private money aimed at accelerating the shift to a green economy. Number 5, environment ministers from 51 countries, including Canada, met in London for a meeting ahead of the annual UN Climate Conference in November. Countries are still not in agreement on the actions needed to hit global climate goals, with China and India opposing the outright elimination of coal plants. I'm Mike Moffat, and those are the 5 things that I'm watching this week.
Thank you, Mike. For a second glance at those stories, Mike has them written out for you at podcast.smartprosperity.ca. Well, that's it for this episode of Smart Prosperity, the podcast. If you liked it, please share it with your colleagues and friends. Listeners is what keeps this nonprofit podcast in business. If you have feedback or questions, my email and social media info is at podcast.smartprosperity.ca. I'd love to hear from you. In the meantime, a reminder that the views shared on this podcast are not necessarily those of Smart Prosperity Institute. We just like having smart and evidence-based conversations. I'm Eric Campbell. I'm broadcasting from the lands traditionally stewarded by the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. Thanks again for listening. The next episode is out August 18th.